The future of food will be affordable, it will be accessible, it'll be nutritious, and it'll be sustainable for people and the planet, the whole ecosystem, and all the creatures living on it.
Welcome back to Heja Framtiden, the Swedish podcast on the future. Today I'm sitting at my kitchen studio in Stockholm together with Analisa Winther. Welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
Tell us why you are in Stockholm in the first place.
Well, I am on my way to the big meet, which if you are in the Nordics and working in food, I would say is one of the really big gatherings that we have for bringing the community together. And I will be moderating a stage there, and then I'll also be speaking about the future of food, the Nordic's vision for the future of food. So it's been 2 years since the pandemic started, and I think everyone's kind of anxious to see each other in real life again.
By the community, you mean the foodtech community in the Nordics? And
yeah, I always feel like foodtech's a misnomer a little bit, just because food is so broad, and it really does touch everything. And I always say that if you give me something you're interested in, I can tell you how it relates to food. And tech is definitely a part of it, but tech is such a part of all of our lives at this point that, I don't know, I always kind of want to dig into the definition of food tech and question it a little bit.
Let's just call it food.
And agriculture, yeah.
That being said, you run a podcast called the Nordic Food Tech Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to where it all started, because you are half American, half Danish.
Mm-hmm.
And you moved to Copenhagen
when I was 18. Just a baby. Yes.
Schitt's Creek reference.
Yes, you got it.
it.
Thank you. So my dad is Danish. He comes from the southern part of Denmark, Lolland. And my mom is from Wisconsin in the U.S. I was born in New York City. I grew up in New Jersey. And I did not grow up particularly Danish, meaning we always had Danish pancakes on Saturday morning, and we had certain Christmas traditions. But I did not grow up speaking Danish, and I definitely would identify as American. But I hold dual citizenship. So when I was 18 and looking at where I should go to college, I knew I wanted to study international business, and I managed to get into the international business program at Copenhagen Business School. That's a whole other story in itself that's really good, especially if you want to talk about education. But basically, I had the best deal ever. If you go to school in the U.S., it costs $250,000. In Denmark, it's free, and they pay you a stipend every month. So not only did we save a lot of money, but I managed to go live in Hong Kong as part of an exchange program. I also got to go to UNC Chapel Hill. And along the way, I got involved in the startup community. So I did my bachelor's, then I did my master's in Denmark, and kept on working after that. Moved back to the U.S. very recently, and now have gone to be a digital nomad so that I can fully be between the Nordics and between the U.S. and really act as a bridge between those two worlds.
And as I understand it, you started working with the Singularity U Nordic in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And this was not that many years ago?
Well, it was kind of many years ago. It was when I was in my late teens. It was the first job I had. So at that point, before Singularity U Nordic existed, there was the people that founded it and were part of founding it had another co-working space that I was working at and a part of running. So very early on, I got into the tech scene. I was very much a part of when Copenhagen was really realizing that there was this budding tech scene and we really need to bring the community together. We need to enable people to collaborate. And back in the day, that was when Twitter just came out. So the big way of organizing people was to create a hashtag that was Copenhagen for the win. And if you use the hashtag on Twitter, then you could see all the tweets of other members in the community. And suddenly we realized that there were, a couple hundred, if not 1,000 people in this. And then that led to so much development in terms of connection and people talking and investment and this and that. So all of that to say, I was part of that budding ecosystem. And then we ended up meeting the people from Singularity University. We went on to start the first kind of Nordic hub or international hub, and I was the director of community and operations. So my job was basically to connect people, know what everyone was doing, and then figure out how do we enable more people to work together?
Oh, so that's why that's where the networking philosophy came from in the first place.
Yes. Nobody understands what I do for a living, and I can say that with confidence. And I'm still inventing it as I go along because just when you think of entrepreneurship, I believe a lot in designing your life for success, but also based in your own superpowers and whatever it is that you're good at, you should do. And I would say I am really good at connecting people. I've had successful love matches. And now today as a professional, I work in business matchmaking. So really looking at what are the values and the vision of what you want to create in this world. And then how do you bring different capabilities together to create that? And it's very fun work, but it's very rooted in collaboration because I believe to create the future, you need to work together. And this started many years ago when we were looking at different technologies that were converging together and the opportunities from it, but also what can we learn from diversity of perspective and bringing together people that come from different interest areas to see what ideas can you come up with, and then how do we facilitate you further. So I've always worked in that space of ecosystem development, collaboration as a service, connecting.
What do you mean with, I saw that you mentioned collaboration as a service. What do you mean by that exactly?
So I don't know if I totally invented it, but I feel like I just call what I do that, meaning I offer a service. It's a consulting service. And I do think it's a service to act as a connector. I give examples in two different capacities of this. One is if you think of a massive corporation, let's say it's 200,000 people, you literally need the person that sits and talks across all the different silos to make sure they're working together efficiently and also that they're relaying the strategy and that things are going as they should. So that's one example of my job is to be the collaborator, the connector that works across and provides the service of making sure the knowledge is flowing. So if you imagine the information booth, people go to that one knowledge node in the cluster to then look out from there and figure it out. I think there's also just this idea that if you work in any industry, collaboration as a service is very needed. And people are so busy, they have their families, they have their work, and it's exhausting trying to get anything off the ground and start anything and just run your life day to day. Many people don't want to go through networking. They don't want to take the time to have coffees and figure out if it's a good match for them and if it's worth their time. So they'll just say no instead of saying yes. That if you can have people like me who go out and say, hey, I know you're into this and I know you're looking for this. If I see a connection, I'll make it for you and then we'll take it from there. So it's kind of how I operate just in terms of knowing a lot of people and then bringing them together when it makes sense.
That's brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, I love it. It's also perfect that you're American. You can always get away with it.
I know. I'm lucky. And for a long time, I really felt like I didn't fit in the Nordics, even though I'm Danish and I have the passport and all of my dad's side of the family is here. I'm totally seen as an American and people, think of me as such. So I often felt like I didn't fit in. And now when I've come back, I've kind of embraced it. But I definitely err on the side of just being like shamelessly open and very talkative and excited and curious. And curiosity is one of my biggest values.
So, and I remember you saying, because we did an email interview a few years ago for my magazine, Food System magazine. And you mentioned that you realized at Singularity U that the food system problems and opportunities run through all the SDGs. But was that when you sort of realized that this is what I need to focus on?
Yes, there's of course more detail to this story. So the truthful version, I'll tell you that I like to tell people sometimes, is that I actually lost my job. And it happened very suddenly that I left a very stable job to then go into a startup. It was a total 6 months and then it was over kind of thing. So I just didn't have a plan B at that point. I just started my plan B in my next adventure. And I was really left in a quandary of wondering what's next and what am I going to do. And I ended up doing a bunch of mini internships because I had a list of 10 different things I thought I could be good at. I was kind of young in my career. And I thought if I could have these mini internships and just try it out for size, I would know, is this the right fit for me? Is this the direction I want to go in? And in that process, I ended up really randomly, or a friend told me about the World Food Summit that was happening in Copenhagen. And it was happening at the parliament. So it was all of these politicians flying in for like a big Ministry of Agriculture kind of meeting. And I totally thought I could go because on their website, they were just like, yeah, come on and attend. And it was the night before and there were no more tickets. They had closed the registration. So I actually called the number on the website and got the head of events and asked her if I could come. And she said, yeah, sure, just show up tomorrow. It's fine. So I walked up to Parliament the next day saying, I'm here for the event with all the ministers. And they were like, oh no, honey, we didn't mean you could come into this event. We meant you could be across town where it's live streamed with all the other kind of, not commoners, but like the other people. So that was cool. And I went to that event, but there I ended up meeting Pink, which is Paulig's incubator. They're a big food and beverage company. And they offered me a position more or less on the spot in terms of working with them to identify what is the future of taste. And then as a corporate venture capital arm, how can you invest in different startups? And I was the one that was kind of looking at the Danish scene. And that was very transformational because my job was basically to drink coffee with really cool people, working across the ecosystem to figure out what should we invest in. And in doing that and being a natural connector, I realized no one was talking to each other. And then I would stay up all night sending emails being like, hey, so-and-so, you have to talk to so-and-so. And that quickly, not to say I didn't have enough time, but I became my own bottleneck. I'm just one person. I can only meet so many people. So I decided to start my own podcast, which would really remove me as the bottleneck and enable peer-to-peer connection. And for those who have not heard my name or heard of the podcast, it's called the Nordic Foodtech Podcast. And I interview individuals and organizations who are creating the future through food. And at the end of every episode, I ask 4 questions. And that is, what is your vision for the future of food in 10 to 15 years? What are we missing to get there? What collaborations are you looking for? And how can someone get in touch? And I can totally dig into why I find those questions very important. But I found that a lot of collaboration can come out of people telling their stories and telling what help they need and then how to just reach out to them. And especially in the Nordics where we tend to be a little shy or have jentelaw, it makes it so much easier when you know what someone's looking for to just write them and be like, hey, I have your answer. I'd love to talk to you. You know, you can make that pitch a little bit better.
Yeah, I love it when I hear people like, yeah, I listened to the episode with that lady and so I emailed her and we were having coffee.
Yes.
I'm like, wow.
Yes.
Never saw that coming, but because they're in totally different industries maybe, but you know, they had something interesting that I needed as a piece of the puzzle, so I reached out.
But
that must happen all the time without us knowing it.
I mean, you've been unbelievably prolific in the work you've done, and I've followed it for quite some time, and I often wish I could speak Swedish so I could listen to all the episodes. But I think that I describe it as going from a cold lead to a warm lead, that if you can listen to someone's story, who they are as a person, what they believe in, how they approach the world, it is so much easier to connect. And you know, like we all have such strong intuition. From the moment we meet someone, we know if we like them, if we want to work with them, if we're inspired, if we're, you know, whatever's going on there. So I think that the voice and listening to podcasts and listening to stories is such an incredible vehicle for connection. And I'm not surprised at all that your podcast has inspired people to collaborate and work together, especially when you think about the future.
Yeah, it's also so much easier and relaxing to listen to a person talking about something they love. I mean, you can't really be afraid of someone that you listen to for half an hour telling their story. It's not the same as a cold email. As you said, the lead becomes warm.
Yeah.
Immediately, even if that's not the case. But for me, reaching out, it's much easier, I think, if you have that kind of connection.
I 1,000% agree. And I think for our field, did you see the story with Joe Rogan recently where he had on this doctor that was talking about COVID and people said it was a misinformation campaign? Did you see that? So one of the articles I read critiquing that is that I listened to it and I kind of believed what he said. I hate to admit it, but like I listened to it for an hour and a half, 2 hours because everyone was talking about it. And by the end, I was convinced that he had great arguments. And it was so personal that if you're in someone's ears, as I am in your ears right now, or you're in their home, you're on their radio, it is a very intimate relationship listening to someone's voice. So we also have a huge responsibility around the messages we're sending out and what we're putting on air. And I often not to say I went to journalism school, because kind of a lot of what I do is deep research and telling stories in journalism. But I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with this medium too, because it is so intimate and so personal.
And by the time we released this episode, you've already been on stage at the big meet. But what are you going to talk about? You said in your podcast that you will reveal some of the main insights from the work with your podcast. Can you reveal them now?
Yes, of course I can. So glad you asked. No. So I've done now over 80 podcasts interviewing people across the supply chain, across the Nordics, on what their vision for the future of food is. And before I dive into what that is and why it matters, I think it makes sense to talk about why I even asked that question. But I'm also a certified coach, and I work with a lot of people in terms of their leadership and communication style, and knowing what is the vision for their own life, what is their vision for the company, and then what are the values that they have, and how do you operate in the world? How do you approach it? And the same is true in business. Any business is based on its culture, and it's all extremely connected. And when I started working in food, I realized that, one, it was super compartmentalized and very siloed, but I also was really missing the common vision we're all working towards. And food is so fundamental to all of us and everything that we do that it's very hard to create and collaborate and work together if you don't have a North Star that's orienting you. So I got really curious. And that became very much the first question I wanted to get to the bottom of, is asking people, what are you building towards? What is it you're trying to create? What do you hope our world is going to look like? We're in the face of climate change, like in 10 to 15 years, what are we doing differently? Food is 25% of climate emissions. There's a lot of work to be done. So that was the first one. And then beyond that, it's the what are we missing to get there? What are the challenges that we're facing? So now that I've done 80 of those interviews, that's a lot of data. It's over like 1,000 pages that I've been reading through and synthesizing and sitting with. And I'm working on it in a bunch of different capacities, but I really wanted to tease out what is it that we're saying and we're thinking, not to get the basis of a manifesto, but just to get a conversation going around, do we agree? And right now, even when you look at food, it's very national. I mean, food is a matter of national security. We need to make sure our people have food, otherwise it can lead to war. There's so many aspects to this, but we don't have a Nordic vision. We don't have a Nordic connection in the way that we could for being very small countries that share similar values and who are all desiring to export the knowledge we have and the passion for sustainability we have to other markets. So I've spent the last 6 months curled up in my library, reading through these pages with my highlighter.
You had every episode transcribed.
Oh, yes. It's been a lot of work to do that. And I hired help from Upwork to do it because I quickly realized it was going to be very difficult.
It's so boring.
It is hard. And it's like you've already heard the conversation, but more than that, editing language takes a really long time. And there's a lot of ums when you have Swedish, Danish, Norwegian speakers who are flipping over to the other side.
Yeah.
So I think the big headline is that the future of food will be affordable, it will be accessible, it'll be nutritious, and it'll be sustainable for people and the planet, the whole ecosystem, and all the creatures living on it. And then underneath that, there's certain driving forces that we see in terms of where it's headed and what is the language that we're using. And then there's a bunch of common challenges, and I'd even call them levers that the Nordics are really good at pulling on in terms of forcing this change. I'll preface all of this by saying this is based in the Nordic region, but I think these are trends that we're seeing globally, and it's kind of like this process of deglobalization that we had a very globalized food system, but now we're getting back to our roots or back to the local a little bit, and that's going to create commonalities. I don't think we're going to stop trading with each other by any means, but we're also going to see a return to what is our regional strengths.
I think it's a regionalization.
Yeah, and it's super linked to energy too, and the energy transition. That as people go to producing their own energy, oil and gas is also really linked to food in a bunch of different ways. You can kind of see this happening together, that there's definitely a trend there. The first thing I'd say that people are looking at is this term regenerative agriculture. So we've had a big focus on organic, and I say that regenerative is kind of the next big thing, but it's something we've kind of known and talked about for a while, which is this idea that whatever we take out of the earth, we're going to put back in. And regenerative as a notion is being applied to every single business area to say, how do we create these circular business models? How do we make models that are good for people, that regenerate like the spirit of people and the health of people, but also the health of the planet, and are sustainable in the long run? So I think that's a big piece of what we're looking towards. And when within regenerative agriculture, and we talk about emissions, that is also saying that agriculture and food emits carbon, but it can also act as a carbon sink. So we can draw it down out of the atmosphere and we can store it. Soil can take in carbon. Ingredients like seaweed can take in carbon. So there's also a lot of potential for what can we pull down and what can we do. And then when you look at regenerative agriculture, there is a huge focus on biodiversity and resilience. So that is one of the biggest things for all of us, that we need to eat more diverse things. And whether that's any kind of alternative protein or just generally diversifying the meals you go through in a week, that helps to support the overall ecosystem, that we don't lean too heavily into any one mono thing or another thing, but also that we need to make sure that there's resilience. And we know that, like, I always go to the financial analogy of don't put all your eggs in one basket because you're going to see a bad time when it comes. The same is true in the food system, that a forest is resilient when you have lots of different plants. If it's all one species, it can get wiped out by disease or anything else that comes along. So it's very important for us to think of food in the same way, along with our diets, along with what we're planting and what we're growing.
Yeah, generally, I think diversification is the talk of the moment now.
Yes. And it's diversity of thought, diversity of actors. And I think that's the other trend you see too, is that there are going to continue to be these big global players and big global movements, but there's definitely increased focus on local and the resurgence of small producers or people that are looking at heritage grains or looking at heritage varietals of seeds in different areas to say, what is really from here? And what is our connection to this place? How can we be stewards of this land? And sometimes I laugh because I feel like we're innovating tradition, or we're kind of putting a twist on what grandma used to do, but just with a modern angle. And science is being used to explain things that we have intuitively known for a long time, and our ancestors did because they knew that's how you took care of the land. And if you want to stay there, that's what you got to do. There's very much a return to both the indigenous ways of doing things, but also use the whole animal. Nothing goes to waste, zero waste, like take care of what you have respect. Those are values that have been around a long time, but that we just got out of touch with in the last 50 to 100 years. So it's a little bit interesting how we're finding our way back, and tech and science is being used as a way to get us there. But I also think people feel it in their bones that something is off and we need to reconnect.
Yeah, I think especially regenerative agriculture is one of those topics that are so intuitive in a way. It's like, yeah, let's work with nature instead of against nature.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, yeah, that's what we used to do. Use cattle to, fertilize the land, and to use insects and weeds to increase biodiversity, etc. I mean, it all makes sense. It's just that we have gone so accustomed to the monocultures of the industrialization that we sort of forgot this in a way.
It's not rocket science. But people have these eureka moments where they're like, we've just discovered how to do X, Y, Z. And it's like, no, it's kind of been a thing that was done, or a way of thinking that's been done a long time. It's just that we need to find our way back to that in a modern context, because we're not going to go back to doing things the way they were done 200 years ago. I don't think anybody expects that.
No.
But I do think that there is a huge focus on staying humble in some regards, to recognize that there is so much we don't know. We don't really understand how the ecosystem fully operates, though we do know that everything serves a purpose. And when you mess with the balance, things happen and there's a ripple effect. And that's what humans have sort of kind of done when it comes in and manipulating things in all kinds of regards. And we have an enormous ability to design our food system, design the foods we eat, how the products looked. There's a lot of that goes into it. And that's a whole other area in terms of like communication, almost, of how you understand it and how you create it, and artificiality. But I keep coming back to this notion of humbleness and stewardship, and recognizing that we are a small piece of a whole, and we can't act like we're dominating nature, because we need it to survive. And whatever happens to us, the earth will come back. It's not the earth that's in question. It's it's some other things.
Do you still work with connecting investors and food tech startups?
Yes. So I think of my business in terms of a triangle with 3 points. And one is the communication side of things in the podcast and really spreading the ideas, creating role models of how people are creating the future through food, and then also enabling this connection. And then I have another leg that's purely based in connection where I do my consulting work. And that's everything from going out and doing speaking gigs to talk on this area to then working largely with corporations and their corporate venture capital arms to matchmake them to the kinds of startups they're looking for or other partners in the ecosystem they're looking for to say, what are the relationships you want to create? And then how do we get you in cooperation with them? And that can be investment, it can be building, it can be partnering. There's many different models. It's kind of like the finding your way before the merger and acquisition or the M&A of like, who are we going to do the M&A with? That's the space I play in. It's very people-centered. And then the final part of that is coaching, where I work with people individually, but it's also kind of a natural part of the process to say, if you want to build a strong business relationship, it's like a marriage. Like you do have to know what is it you want in this life, in this business? What are you trying to create? You know, the values and how you operate. So I always get into discussion with people on those topics to say, have you done that work that you can answer it? Because many relationships fall apart when times are going really well as when times are going bad. And if you have those values as a core, you can find your way back and you can communicate through. But if you haven't done that, it's going to fall apart. So it's really important to come into the relationship knowing that kind of stuff. And then on my podcast, I actually brought on a love matchmaker. He's Swedish, to talk about how he puts love matches together. Because I think there's so much we can draw between how we think about love, how much we invest in love in terms of finding a partner and like, you know, going to a therapist or whatever you might do to make yourself more ready for it, and the business world and how we create and design great relationships there. So it was kind of a best principles. What can we learn from a professional matchmaker idea?
Do you still feel that the different actors of the food system are not talking to each other enough?
Yes.
Yes.
There's much work to be done. Yeah. One, because it's huge, but again, like forums. We've had a pandemic for 2 years. There's been no way, more than that, there's been no way for people to connect. It's really hard to get paid to work in this space. It's really important for people to come together, but who wants to foot the bill to put on the conference? Or who wants to foot the bill for someone to take all the coffee chats? You know, there's this question of who's leading or being the mediator, and then what are the motives of that organization? There's lobbyist groups that kind of do this stuff. There's associations, but they represent different meanings or will. And I act more as a free agent in terms of who can I help how than it is I'm obliged by my members to do X, Y, Z. I like a lot more freedom, editorial freedom in terms of this podcast, the podcast I run as well. All of that to say, I think there's a lot of work to be done connecting people. And I think that it's almost like translation work. Like the way that a chef talks is really different from a suit. You know, they do not speak the same language. So you need someone who can help to translate and communicate the style in a different way. And they're definitely not hanging out. Even if they're eating in the same restaurant, it's not like they're hanging, you know?
Yeah, we talked about this briefly before we started, that the magazine I'm running is, everyone loves it. They're so interested in, this initiative is so great. We're not going to be joining this time, but keep up the good work. Mm-hmm. It's like, but you're a part of the system, and there's a way of getting people to talk and to find new connections and to communicate the good things you're doing. So please join, or it will be no next time. That's kind of frustrating.
It is very frustrating. And for me, it goes back to the vision in terms of, do people understand that they're part of something bigger? Because it's easy to go in your own self-interest. And I think that's where we're still missing the collective. What are we all working towards? And what do we need to disseminate? Or why do we all need to read this? Or where do you get inspiration from? And it's also why, when it comes to my podcast, I've thought of it more as my passion project than the way that I make money, because it is really hard to make money as a content creator. And there's every business who's in this business has been struggling to do it. But it's also almost feels like a service. And we just need more people to talk to each other. So that's where it comes from in its root. But I totally think there needs to be a way for people to be making money in this space. And I have also not cracked the code myself in terms of knowing what really works or what resonates with people and what will get them to say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough nut.
I usually ask, what is your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
Well, there's so many. And I think I'll maybe mention 2 more points around the trends I see with the future of food that can help to answer that and relate. One thing is definitely around efficiency. So there's so much happening in terms of digitization still in every industry. But within food, there's a lot around transparency and authenticity, and that people want to know where their food comes from. They want to trust it, but they also want to trace it, meaning, did it come from the farm down the road or is it from the other side of the world? And how do I find out that information? But then there's this other side of information overload that people want to easily and effortlessly be able to make the right choice without having to think too much, without having to do hours of research, whatever it takes. So I do think that technology and efficiency is going to play a huge role in terms of improving supply chains, eliminating food waste, understanding the volumes of how much we produce, where does that food flow, are we putting it to the best use? How can we upcycle it and make sure we use every single thing and kind of factor in the low-hanging fruit? And then also, it plays right into technology in terms of what are the technologies we can create to remove some of the hard labor that has been involved in producing food that maybe could be done by a machine to help us produce the right amount, or, think of it in a smarter capacity. So I think there's a lot there in terms of how we can optimize. And that will also help to bring down the cost, because another big topic that comes up is the true cost of food, meaning food is way too cheap now for what it is. Food that is cheap tends to have really bad things in it, and really good food costs more. And that's truly what the cost of food is when you think of the water it uses and like the land it uses and the resources it uses, but we're not used to paying that. And there's a lot of psychology that's been done around the fact that people want to pay for the lowest price. So you have to make it competitive, and you have to be using technology to bring the price down, to democratize it, to make it more acceptable. So all of it kind of fits together in a very complex way to say, how can we deliver it to make sure that it happens? Yeah. That's a lot of things, I know. You're like, what?
Do you have any good reading tips or podcast tips apart from your own podcast?
I'm not going to name anything that's related to food, which I guess is funny, but I really love the podcast On Being by Krista Tippett. And there's many interesting conversations that happen there. It's from NPR. And then this is another form of digesting, but there's someone on Instagram called Face Hunter, and he does a lot of traveling and doing street fashion, but also interviews with people around their culture. And I find it such a fun, interesting, quick way to digest what's happening on the ground in other parts of the world. But those are 2 that I consistently come back to and I listen to and I really enjoy. And then also The Decoder, which is a startup kind of podcast around interviewing different executives in tech and how they're thinking of their organization and decision making and inventing the future, of what navigates our lives.
Great. Who do you think I should interview?
This is a hard question because I feel like you've interviewed a lot of people, and I might name someone you've already interviewed, but have you interviewed politicians?
Not that many, actually.
I feel like politicians are not enough in this world. Yeah. It's one, difficult because, of course, they're really good at talking, but 2, they can be hard to get and bring over. But when you talk about collaboration, one of the things that clearly the jury is out on in the work I do is the future going to be driven by business models and economic incentives and financial capital that moves the space, or is it going to be regulation? And I think when we talk about the business world, there is so much room for politicians to join the conversation. One, to understand the budding interests of new technologists, entrepreneurship, new budding industries, and what they need to move forward, but also in terms of what's the regulation that's going to be for the consumer first. So I would be very curious to talk more with politicians and hear how they're thinking, but also pull them into the dialogue and make sure they're there. And then personally, I would love to interview more like the Sami population. I have that on my list. I have a long list of podcasts I want to do, but there's a lot of segments. We tend to focus on like not the big city folk, but I think there's a lot of other segments that are involved in the conversation that often don't get enough attention, and that we should make sure there's diversity of voices being heard and how do we give them a platform too? So whoever you have not interviewed that should be interviewed is my answer.
Diplomatic answer. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Analisa Winther, for joining Heja Framtiden.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Make sure to check out Analisa's podcast, the Nordic foodtech podcast. And where can we find you on social media?
At Nordic foodtech on Instagram. And then my website is www.nordicfoodtech.io.
You have a newsletter on Substack as well.
That's correct, yes. And that's nordicfoodtechpodcast.substack.com.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Check out hejaframtiden.se for more information about the podcast and my other projects with lectures and magazines, books, and my little publishing house that I recently started. My name is Christian von Essen. Thank you so much for listening to Heja Framtiden.